I'm passing it over to Francois.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Christine. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be in this virtual room together with Agnes Kaposi, whose memoir we celebrate this evening. And I would like to show the book to our audience. It's a remarkable book in many respects. We will see a couple of images which are contained in the book. This is already one of the qualities of the book, that it contains an extremely impressive wealth of documentation, photographs, documents, maps. So throughout the book, the ambition of the author is recognizable to be as precise a chronicler as possible. Also, and this is perhaps the starting point of our conversation, Agnes, also the account is remarkably precise. I have not studied memoirs of this type in comparison, but the amount of information which you present here is just striking. My first question is, how long did you work writing this book, and who helped you with it?
Oh, well, it wasn't started as a book to be published. It started by my granddaughter, who is now 22, at the age of 10, saying, why should she learn about Second World War history out of books when she can come and talk to me and ask me questions? And she asked me questions, and I tried to answer as best I could. And that's when I started to write for my family the recollection of the things that happened to me before arriving in this country and a little bit afterwards as well. My memories were very vivid, pictorial. I could even, for example, draw out for you where I sat in a classroom at various parts of my schooling. I wrote it as I would be talking, as if I was talking to my granddaughter. Then it occurred to me that there should be some verification of my memories. After all, many of the things I was writing about happened when I was a little child, 3/4 of a century ago. How can I trust my memory? So I started to research. My husband was at that time still alive, and he read every word I wrote. And it amounted to a much longer description of the events of my life and the background intended for my family. And then various friends came and said, you are writing something, maybe read. And I started to be encouraged for it to be whittled down, somehow compressed, to be ready for publication. And it took a very, very long time. And all the time while I was writing, I kept on looking for a historian to help me, because I was unsure that what I write is as truthful as it can be. And very, very luckily, and with your help, Francois, I hit upon the idea of collaborating with a historian, and my good fortune brought me together with Dr. László Csősz, who is in the audience now. And he writes a historian's stream across the book.
Yes.
Altogether, it took about nearly 12 years.
Yeah. I mean, just to explain this to the audience, I mean, the book is based on Agnes narratives, and after every chapter, there is what is called the historian's voice, which adds factual information, background, discussion of scholarship, and complements the account of Agnes. So the book is extremely an extremely rich offering, helping us to understand the trajectory of Agnes, but much more. And I think I would like to look into your first years of your life, and I will show a photograph in a moment. These earlier stages of your life were in Debrecen and then in Budapest. And the life you describe is one of a household which is somehow, I shouldn't say governed, but taken care of by your grandmother. And she must have been an extremely wise and strong woman. And I would like to now share the first slide. This is Nanoka. And I hope everyone is able to see the photograph of the maternal grandmother of Agnes. And I read a review of your book, Agnes, and the reviewer observed the same thing which stuck to my mind when I read it, namely Nanoka producing dough for strudel. And this is an image of a provincial Jewish household which is centered around home life and well, the economy of the family, where the maternal grandmother had a lot of control in the sense of taking care of things. I found the description very impressive. And perhaps you can tell us more, Agnes, how Nanoka influenced your life and your trajectory.
Well, she influenced the life of everybody who came in contact with her. She stood something like 4'8" high when she pulled herself up. She was tiny. She was a bundle of energy. She was brought up in the country. She was a country girl at heart. She never went to school because she was brought up in the country. So she could read and write, but couldn't punctuate. That never stopped her from being intelligent, naturally intelligent. She was widowed very early, brought up 3 daughters. She was a businesswoman. And if you knew what was good for you, then you wouldn't try to cheat her. She set extremely high standards for herself and everybody else. And she planned ahead, and to a great extent, our survival in the camps depended on her wisdom and her provisions for us. We adored her. Some people feared her. There was no need to fear her. She was fierce and strict and warm-hearted and generous. She was fantastic. I adored her.
Can you expand on how Nanoka helped your family survive?
Well, to start with, in the ghetto, there were rumors all the time. The essence of the ghetto atmosphere was uncertainty and fear. We didn't know where we were going, how long are we going to be there. The life was impossible, it couldn't last very long. And everybody was afraid, but nobody planned other than my grandmother. My extended family consisted of some old people, a couple of toddlers, a little boy of 5, and a number of adults, mostly women. It wasn't a very viable group, and her question to herself was, how can she prepare us for leaving the ghetto? So she sewed for each of us a rucksack out of a tough material, originally intended as canvas for deck chairs. These rucksacks we could carry on our backs, while in our arms we could carry the toddlers. One was 2 and the other 3 years old. We could assist our elderly. There was somebody in her late 70s among members of the family. And without these rucksacks, we would have been quite unable. There's a picture here of a group of Jews leaving the ghetto. We would have been quite unable to look after members of the family. Also, because she was a country girl, we worked for a while under very difficult conditions. We worked in agriculture, and she knew the trees, the weeds, the crops, and she taught us what berries were edible, how we could supplement the ridiculously inadequate food with the
herbs and
as you say, herbs and saps of trees, whatever. She imposed standards of cleanliness, even in the camps, which kept us as healthy as we could possibly be. It was she who set the standards, and the standards were high, and those were keys to the survival of nearly all of the 13 members of our extended family, including the 2 toddlers.
Yeah. The other remarkable woman in your early life is your mother, who the relationship between your parents, obviously, we shouldn't be nosy, etc. But she was the person who secured the material survival of the family. And I show everyone the picture of a shop in Budapest. Can you tell us more how you came from, how the family moved from Debrecen to Budapest?
Well, we had to move because my father was a prominent socialist. And in the big provincial city of Debrecen, he was very well known, very highly respected by the working people. And soon after my birth, an extreme right-wing government came to power. My father lost his job and he became blacklisted. He became unemployed and unemployable in the city of Debrecen. And my mother was 11 years younger than my father. At that time, she was 22. They hoped to find anonymity, at least, in Budapest. My father never really got a proper job thereafter, because first his socialist background and later his Jewish identity made him unable to obtain employment fitting his capabilities. He was an extremely gifted man. And my mother became the sole breadwinner, not only of my family, but also of her sisters. She had 2 younger sisters, married to professional men, one to an engineer, the other to a lawyer. And these young graduates were not able to be employed. This was part of the sequence of anti-Jewish laws, which the right-wing Hungarian government brought on. And my mother became the sole breadwinner of the whole extended family. This shop, which is now a bank, was a small shop. Dairy products were sold there, and behind the shop there was a room, and in that room we lived. We had a flat, but we only used the flat for sleeping in. Otherwise, we lived behind the shop. It's about, a couple of 100 yards from the Houses of Parliament.
The image of you at this stage of your life, and there's another one which shows you on the balcony of the building in which you lived, show a very alert young lady, I have to say. I mean, the other photograph, perhaps even more so than this one, although this one is already, I mean, betraying a very intense grasp of the world. And I would like to ask you, I mean, the emphasis on education, this is something which came more from your father, right? impacted on your life, I mean, throughout your youth, that education and achievement in school was important, wasn't it?
Well, you will read from my book and from what I already told you, it must be obvious, we were really quite poor. But the material poverty contrasted with the intellectual ambition that my family had. This was to a large extent shared by Jews in general. But I think it was exaggerated by my father's interest in the betterment of himself and all working people. And he imposed an intellectual standard. In my family, there is a joke which is really rooted in history. When I got home from school with 90% of the marks, my father wanted to know what went wrong. And this idea of trying to work to the full capability of each individual, that guided me. And I tried to guide my own students with the same principle. Yeah. That it is, we have the gift which is given to us. We have to make the best use of it that we possibly can. I'm almost sorry that you don't have here available in front of us the other picture you referred to. That shows a bright and cheerful 5-year-old. Ready to go to, eager to go to school. This picture shows a 10-year-old who had already been beaten down by the anti-Jewish laws and by a vicious fascist teacher. But nevertheless, there is concentration here, which shows my attitude throughout my life.
So when the war starts, your parents have to move back to Debrecen from Budapest?
Yes, the Germans occupied Hungary on the 19th of March 1944, which is an interesting event in itself, and the background is described in my book. After all, Hungary was fighting the war on the German side, and nevertheless, there was a decision to occupy the country. When the Germans marched in, by that time, it's interesting, almost all the Jews of Europe were killed. In Hungary, because Hungary was on the German side, the civilian Jews were still at home, living in their homes. They thought that they escaped. But when the German occupation happened, then it was my mother who said, oh, there is big trouble. The Germans are here. The family have to be together. And my grandmother was in Debrecen. My young aunts had returned to their mother when their husbands were taken into the Hungarian army. So the core of the family was in Debrecen, and we traveled, my mother, father, and I, on the last train. Dr. Csősz confirmed for me this was the last train from Budapest to Debrecen that a Jew could travel on. Yes. On that train, we did go to Debrecen, and that's where we were clamped into the ghetto, and our life then was that of provincial Jews.
For about a year?
No, much less than that. The whole story is compressed to a few weeks almost. Okay. The Germans came on the 19th of March. The ghetto was formed, and in fact, the deportation from the ghetto happened in the last days of June. Right.
So on this image, we see the fence cordoning off the ghetto in Debrecen.
That is right.
And here again, I mean, both these elements of your early years. I mean, the very strong women safeguarding the family in Nanoka's courtyard is one element, and your father insisting that you go to school is another one. And you, if I remember correctly, you attended a boys' school in this instance.
It's an almost funny story, if you can have a funny story in ghetto times. Before the ghetto was formed, the Jewish boys' grammar school of Debrecen was still functioning. There was no Jewish girls' grammar school. In fact, I don't think there was any Jewish boys' grammar school anywhere in the country. And when we arrived in Debrecen, my father took me to the school and demanded that the headmaster permits me to stay. I was in the first year of the grammar school. And I did go to that school. I was the only girl ever to have been to that school. But the whole story finished. When the ghetto came, the school stopped functioning, and in fact the school stopped functioning altogether.
We have an image which you have included in the book of the deportation from another Hungarian ghetto, Dunaszedahely, which is obviously not Debrecen, but you describe in great detail the chaos. I mean, the ghetto was emptied to a brickyard, and from there people were put on trains. And you describe this in very vivid detail, how extremely difficult these days have been. And what follows is one of the, what I call one of the miracles in your life, being put on a train, which, as all the trains deporting the vast mass of Jews from Hungary, were destined to go to Auschwitz concentration camp and extermination camp. And the miracle is that particularly your train was one of those who were deviated. And perhaps you tell us the story of this terrible journey.
Well, the journey is truly dreadful. There were 87 of us in a cattle wagon, traveling for 4 days and 5 nights. The plan was to clear the provincial Jews from all of the areas surrounding Budapest, take them all to Auschwitz. Anyone who had been to Auschwitz will be told that over half of the people who were deported to Auschwitz and killed there were Hungarian Jews. Hungary is a tiny country, and it has this great distinction of having supplied half of Auschwitz's victims. Now, 15,000 Jews were destined to go to Austria instead, on some kind of program of potential exchange of Jews for moving vehicles. There were negotiations between the British and the Germans, and these exchange Jews were collected in and around Vienna and used as slave laborers, pending the outcome of these negotiations. Now, our train was among those heading for Auschwitz, so we were not meant to be among the 15,000. And uniquely, in fact, I was told by Professor Kadar, quite uniquely, this individual, one train, was diverted from heading for Auschwitz, having crossed the Hungarian border heading for Auschwitz. Instead, we were turned back and we fetched up in Vienna among the 15,000 lucky slave laborers. That's why I'm here. That's why my family is here. That's why my beautiful 5 grandchildren are here, because our train was diverted from Auschwitz and instead we went to Vienna, in the vicinity of Vienna. There it is. Now, the first labor camp that we worked in was Magdalenenhof. It's the tallest spot in Lower Austria, the location of the medium wave transmitter towers of Vienna, and there they are. And immediately below these towers was a farmyard, a state-owned large farm, and we were worked there as farm laborers from the time when we arrived, which was the beginning of July, until the end of the farming year, which came at the end of November, beginning of December. So this was our first labor camp.
The forced labor you were doing consisted of, I mean, let's say normal agricultural activities. I mean, maybe it was picking peas, harvesting wheat, airing grain, grape harvest, potato selection, manure loading, harvesting sugar beets, which must have been a terrible thing because it was sub-zero temperatures, and you had exaggerated your age in order to be part of forced labor. Can you explain why?
Well, as I mentioned before, originally there were 13 members of our extended family, but 2 were killed before we left Hungary, were taken away from us and never heard of thereafter. So there were 11 of us left. And out of the 11, as I said, there were 2 toddlers, age 2 and 3, and there were 3 grannies. And by definition of the rulings of the Germans, they were either too young or too old to work. And I was also meant to be too young to work because I was 11 at the time. But only those who could work were given any food ration at all. So if there had been 5 members of my family working, then their food ration, which was quite inadequate, even a full ration for an individual, would have had to be divided among the 11 members of the family. So I proposed to the family that we lie that I am 14. From the age of 14, you were deemed to be old enough to work. So we lied about my age, and I worked with the adults throughout this period of the agricultural work. If I were to say that the work was hard, then this is an understatement. In some cases, you read in the records of Jews that they worked, I don't know, 10-hour or 12-hour working days. Well, I have no idea how many hours we worked because nobody had a watch, nobody had anything. But we worked, we were woken in the dark. And by the time we got down to the field where we were working, the sun was just beginning to rise. And we were working until the light failed. Mm. And so all I can tell you is that we worked from before sunup to past sundown. And I don't know how many hours. Mm. And I was meant to be an adult.
Yes. I mean, this is obviously an extreme experience, and obviously slave labor. So, undoubtedly. So this lasts until December 1944, when you are brought to Vienna to work in the Ostmarkenwerke. What were the Ostmarkenwerke?
Of course, we didn't know where we were going, what was going to happen. We just fetched up in a factory. It turned out to be one factory of an enormous complex of factories. These were the armament factories of the German Reich, the only region still functioning in December 1944, because those further from the east were already run over by the Soviets, and those from the west by the Allies. So in the middle of the sandwich, there was the region of Lower Austria, where industry, the armament industry was still functioning. We were in the factory where I worked, we were making anti-aircraft guns. And one of the pictures in my book is in fact a picture of the gun on which we worked.
So this lasts a few months. This obviously this very strange end of war period, well, I mean the family survived. Those who have been taken to slave labor survive. Yes. Slave labor survive the bombings of Vienna, which is also a small miracle. You describe in great detail how these people, the forced laborers, many of whom were from Hungary, were functioning together or not so much functioning together. This is, I think, one of the virtues of your account is that you are not a very romantic author. You tell things as they were, without too much, let's say, too much emotional baggage attached to that. Was that difficult to do? For example, I mean, you write about the tensions between people in working, between people doing slave work in Magdalenhof and in the Ostmarkenberg, and you are very frank about the tensions which existed between people who were sharing the same faith.
Well, it's very easy to to oversimplify. All the perpetrators were vicious. All the victims were noble and mutually supportive. That was not the case. There were human beings on both sides. We came across some people, including, for example, the deputy manager of the agricultural camp, who was, as it turns out later, my father confessed, he had been an underground socialist, and he gave information to my father about the state of the war while we were there, at mortal danger to himself. There were a number of people who behaved decently, among those who were surrounding us, who were guarding us, whose victims we were. On the other hand, among the victims, there were those who were behaving as my father did, in a way to support the whole of the community. I write about a friend of mine who was 13-year-old at the time, and he did all kinds of dangerous acts in order to help the community. Oh yes, there were the heroes, but there were also those who were taking advantage of each other, who stole from another Jew. These were Jewish people who did not understand the notion of community, and I remembered these, and I owed it to my grandchildren when I started writing the story to tell the truth. What's the point of writing a story if you are inventing the story? I tried to tell the truth. And when I turned the story for my family into a book for publication, then, like I said before, I had the great good fortune to have some verification of some of the facts from my historian collaborator and others.
So the end of the war, shortly before the end of the war, in March 1945, the slave laborers in Vienna are still are planned to be deported to Theresienstadt, and you are put on a train to Theresienstadt, which obviously was then one of the final destinations of concentration camp inmates to make sure they are not liberated. And another mid-sized miracle occurs here, namely that the train again is not reaching its destination, but is bombed by the Soviets, and you are not. I mean, you are not going to Theresienstadt. Instead, you turn to Hungary in April 1945, and one of the many other virtues of this book is that you tell the story of the post-war period also in great detail and rich detail. And one element which obviously is striking is how much the post-war atmosphere in Hungary resonates with the pre-war atmosphere, which is not particularly friendly to Jews. Can you expand on that?
Well, I don't know what we expected. We expected on return to our home to meet with the men of the family, and we didn't realize that the men of the family, with one exception, were all killed. They never returned from the army. That was one of the disappointments. Another expectation was that we shall go back to our home. We found instead that our home had been taken over by people who had been bombed out of their home. And so our home was not available to us anymore. I went to school the day after our arrival back. Of course, I had to. I was my father's daughter. I went hungry, without a book, without a pencil, without anything. And there was total indifference shown to me by my fellow pupils and by my teachers. Later on, there was even a fascist teacher who treated me in such a way that the liberally minded headmaster made this teacher apologize to my parents for her treatment of me. There was no open anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism was in the atmosphere. It was in the air. It is in the air in Hungary. I did not realize until quite recently that there had been pogroms in Hungary quite extensively. There were some pogroms in Poland as well, killing those few Jews that survived the Holocaust. In Hungary, this was not so widely discussed, certainly not at the time when I lived in the country. And when I came across a description of women of the village, of the small town near my birthplace, to have been killed by the women of the village in 1946. That was before the communist regime was reestablished. I couldn't believe it. And I was told by my historian friend that this was not unique. There were pogroms quite extensively. Later on, during the communist times, there was no open anti-Semitism, but then there was no scope for openly expressing your views about anything at all.
Yes, yes.
But then when the regime changed, and especially in the regime which is now in existence, anti-Semitism is certainly there, and it always has been and is likely always to be. A beautiful poet of the country, one of the great poets, describes the anti-Semitism as being the poison of the soul of the nation.
You, as I said, you described this post-war period in great detail. I mean, the hardship, the poverty, the political oppression. The first school you join is very unpleasant. The second school you join is much better, and this is where you do your, what you call it, A-levels, where you finish. And we have a photograph here, also included in the book, where, I mean, there's a prize for anyone who finds Agnes right now. No, I'm joking. Agnes is top row, second from the left, and this. Well, this is you're at the threshold of adulthood, right?
This is my matriculation class.
Matriculation to the university already.
Yes.
Oh,
well,
okay.
no. This is the last year of the grammar school.
Okay.
In readiness to go to university.
So one of the developments in this period, early post-war period, is that you with your family moved to Újpest, which is not far from Budapest center, and what I found remarkable is that a bit like what you described for Debrecen, that you have there a sort of a small community which emerges, and a small Jewish community which emerges with amateur theater and socializing, etc. And the question I told you I would ask you, so I will ask this question because I think it's of interest to our audience. I mean, this was just 5 years after the end of the war. Everyone had been confronting extreme hardship during the war, has experienced extreme loss, brutalizing slave labor, facing death. My question is whether this featured in social life, in family life. Was there an engaging with this extremely traumatic period?
Újpest is, I don't know to what extent Újpest is a typical case. It now is part of Greater Budapest. It's about 6-8 miles from the center of town. We fetched up there because, like I said before, we had lost our home to those who had been bombed out of theirs. And it described in my book how difficult it was for us to find anywhere to live at all. Újpest had been a significant industrial suburb with 20,000 Jews. Its history is interesting because it was Jewish entrepreneurs who established it and a Jewish industrialist who built it up. And there were, as I say, 20,000 Jews living there and almost nobody, about 10% or less survived. Broken families, a single child from a family, a mother without the husband, without the children. And these broken families were thrown together, as it were, because the atmosphere was not friendly by those who were not Jews. So whether you were religious or not, and my family certainly wasn't, people congregated around what was left of the synagogue. There was a handsome synagogue, a picture of it is in my book, but that had been ransacked. So in some small rooms, these broken families assembled and they tried to make a life for themselves. Material wealth they certainly hadn't, but intellectual enterprise they did have. So there were circles that the adults worked for themselves, and we also formed, we teenagers, about 20 of us, we formed a kind of society, and we had debating society, we had little performances of musical offerings to each other. We played cards, we learned ballroom dancing from the mother of one of us. So we tried to build some kind of a life. This was a Jewish life without religion.
Mm-hmm. But again, my question, reminiscences, memories of the traumatic period were not very present.
They were present everywhere. They were not discussed.
Okay.
Every one of us who was a member of this group, just look at the teenage group, because that's what I was a member of, and that's what I know best. Every one of us had a tragic story to tell.
Yeah.
And we didn't tell these stories. We knew that my friend Mary had lost her mother and her brother, and her father never really properly recovered, and her father and she lived alongside each other without offering each other any, oops, sorry about that, any kind of comfort. There was, for example, Marci. I don't know what his family might have been, but he had nowhere to live and nothing to do, and he became an assistant to the man who was selling geese on the market. These people who had lost everything and everyone, there was no point of us sharing with each other what happened to each of us.
Yeah,
In fact, we were trying to, I think that this is a very healthy thing, don't you think so? Well, we were looking ahead.
You were looking ahead.
We were trying to heal each other instead of look backwards at our stories.
So looking ahead means choosing a path ahead, and you joined the university, Technical University in Budapest, and you. So how did you end up an engineer? How did this happen? I mean, we are obviously in Stalinist Hungary.
Yes.
Was this career chosen for you, or how did you? What would have been your choice? Would you have become let me think, a historian? What would have been your choice if you could have chosen?
No. My father was a born mathematician, and ever since, all the way I can remember, we played mathematical games and puzzles and things. Playing with numbers and learning about science was my life right from the beginning. And I was very lucky. My grandmother lived next door to the director of the Institute of Meteorology. And he took me to his institute with me in Budapest when I was a teenager. There were no computers, of course, and all the forecasting and understanding about the physics of weather, they were all done by calculation by hand. And I thought that this was magic, and I wanted to work with them. And so that's what I wanted to do. I figured out this was not the Technical University at all, it was the University of Sciences. And I would have gone there, and I had a letter of support from the director of the institute, and I was told instead that I had to be an engineer. This was to do with the 5-year plan of the country. A communist country has a 5-year plan, and that extends to absolutely every aspect of the life of every individual of society. And so my choice was either to go to study electrical engineering or not to go to university at all. The story is described, it's bizarre, it's funny. One of the ultimate reason given was that the University of Science, the physics course was full. And that's why I couldn't go. I can go to do electrical engineering. And I found that a girl in my class, I think she's one of the ones on the picture in front of you, wanted to study electrical engineering, and they put her to study physics instead. So we went to the ministry, the same officer who sent her the letter that the course was full, and me the letter, and we said, can we just have a straight swap? And the answer was we couldn't. And the reason was explained by my father, who shortly had a job in the planning department, the people who were making the 5-year plans. and he said well, that the statistics of undergraduate cohorts were given parameters to do with the social background of individuals, and we belonged, this girl and I, to different social categories. And if we had swapped, then the whole statistics would have been invalidated. So that the individuals had to fit the statistics, you see.
The beauties of a planning economy.
Yes, that's right. That's why I'm very grateful to them. I loved my profession. I think it's an exciting, a constructive, a beautiful profession, engineering, and I recommend it to many others.
Can I share this with our audience? I mean, this is your university diploma, and this is not just any diploma. It's a red one. Can you explain why this is special? I mean, it's not. I mean, it's red because it has also a hammer and sickle on it. But this is not. I mean, it's red not because of political meaning.
Oh, it has a political as well as academic statement to make. Everybody's university final certificate, university diploma, looked like this, except everyone's was black with a very, very small number of exceptions who were red. Now, the red diplomas were rarer than firsts in British universities, much rarer. And that signified the exceptional performance. In fact, if you read at the top, it says with red letters, this is diploma of distinction.
Yes, yes. So you were thrown, and for the first time in your life, you were thrown in a co-educational setting, namely the university.
That's right.
You were, if I remember correctly, one of 20% of female students.
Yes. According to the plan, of course.
According to the plan,
right.
And although this was not the career path you had chosen for yourself, you excelled in it. I mean, spectacularly. This is just it's quite remarkable. I was very impressed. I was not such a good student, I have to say. So a red certificate. Whoever will study history, be mindful of the red certificates. I'm also mindful of the time, Agnes. Perhaps the academic work you did was remarkable. I mean, you developed the first TV and phone system you were involved in developing the first TV and phone system for Hungary, and this is part of the degree which you did so splendidly. But while you were studying, you also met your future husband.
Please, may I just make one point with respect to my undergraduate studies. I really never became an engineer like my husband was. My husband was the product of the same course, 4 years my senior. There he is. And he was a full engineer. He was comfortable with the theory, comfortable enough, but he certainly loved gadgets and he was dexterous. He was an engineer. Well, I would have struggled if it hadn't been for my ability to cope with the theory. And the theoretical work is what interested me. And I kept on asking the wrong questions. I could give you some examples. I tried to ask overarching questions because I saw potential similarities between aspects of our engineering program, which were presented as being distant. And later on, I became a systems engineer because that was exactly the direction in which I was capable of coping with. I could deal with concepts much easier than I could deal with the practicalities of engineering. And here is my husband. And me, I was 19, still just 19, and he was.
And I mean, your book is so beautiful because you tell so many fascinating stories. So another miracle in your life is the story of your episode of your wedding, because on the day the wedding was planned, you received the order to join the military student service. We can't go into all these details. These are not details. These are episodes of your life. But making this book so remarkable. I'm really mindful of the time. I think we should move. I don't know. I'm not sure. Yes. No. We don't go to Britain right away. But we should add to what we just said. Well, I mean, you meet your husband and you decide that in the turmoil of the 1956 uprising in Hungary, that you don't see any future for yourself in this country, and you decide to leave, which was an extremely risky and complex undertaking. We could spend quite a bit of time discussing this escape, which again was a little miracle. I mean, that it worked out. Can you describe the next steps, so to speak, after successfully escaping from communist Hungary?
Taking you back just one step,
sure.
We never wanted to stay in Hungary. We were convinced that this was not the country for us. It wasn't the revolution that decided us. It was the revolution that opened a little chink of a doorway through which we tried to squeeze. We married, like I said, when I was 19, but we would never have had children in that country because such was the atmosphere. So we had to escape, and we did. It was quite dramatic. Walking through exploded minefields, getting tangled in barbed wires in the border. In the spirit in which I was brought up, we were helping a family in need, and we were supporting them, and that made our trip much harder. When we finally arrived in Vienna, we had nothing, we knew nobody, and there were loudhailers telling Hungarian refugees, about 150,000 of them, to leave the city at once because the city cannot cope. There is going to be famine and disease, and anybody able should go to the nearest railway station and climb on the first train. And we did, because we were public spirited and young. And so off we went, and on we climbed the train which fetched up in Paris. We then lost our refugee status. We wanted to go to Britain. We went to the embassy and we said, here we are, we have no certificate to prove it, but we are both graduate engineers, and the whole world wants electronic engineers. It's the start of the transistor era and television and radar and whatever, and we knew all about this stuff. And the British embassy very politely showed us the door, and they said that they had enough trouble clearing refugees from Vienna, and we are here in Paris and we should be content. Well, we found ourselves a job, not before me fainting of hunger, and that's all very dramatic and perfectly true, I promise you. But we then found that libraries were heated, and very kindly Frenchmen lent us some money for stamps, and we wrote hundreds of letters to British companies who were advertising in every newspaper and professional journal which we could find in the library. We described ourselves, and I would say a good half, maybe more, replied, yes, please come for interview. This was catch-22. We couldn't come for interview because the country wouldn't let us in. And through good fortune, in due course, a physicist from Cambridge came with the mission of interviewing us. We fetched up in Cambridge. It was a sanatorium. It was a place of haven and beauty, and there were academics and there were people who were, I mean, it was unbelievable. These good people, Mr. and Mrs. Easton, who rented for us for £2.50 a week, 2 rooms in their house. They never had a key to the back door. They had lived there for decades. That was the way that the country was at that time, and Cambridge was at that time.
Perhaps we can come back to the transition from Hungary to Vienna to Paris to Britain in the Q&A, but I think it is time that we end this stage of this event, and because there are people in the audience who I'm sure have questions to you, and I would like to suggest to Christine that she helps us with that and addressing questions which may arise.
Good.
Christine, you are muted, Christine.
I'm muted, yes. Rookie mistake. It's as if I haven't done a Zoom before. Just to remind everyone, you can ask a question through the chat feature, and then we will direct this back to Agnes and Francois.
More than that, if I may ask you, you can make comments. I would be most grateful.
Here's one comment that's come through from Jennifer. She's saying that she hopes your talk is only part 1. She would like more.
Thank you.
I think what is, I mean, for me being a historian, it is very intimidating to speak to an accomplished engineer like Agnes, and preparing for this evening, she showed me her books, and this is extremely interesting. It's extremely impressive to see the kind of system theory which Agnes has developed and has been recognized internationally. I see a question
from Professor Polonsky.
I see the question in the chat, which I can just read to Agnes.
Go on.
From Anthony Polonsky. He asks, your father was a socialist. How did he react to the post-war situation in Hungary?
Oh, well, that's a very, very interesting and very difficult question. My father thought that finally society has arrived. But he then found that socialists like himself were pursued with almost similar vigor by the communists as they had been by the right-wingers previously. In the election, when the communists came to prominence in 1947, in fact, in the previous election, I think it was, when my father was representative of the local Socialist Party at the polling booths. You know, each of the parties were there to oversee that the voting is fairly and properly democratically conducted. And they were not. There were multiple votes by the Communist Party, and there were people who registered postal votes as well as turning up in person, and so on and so forth. And you didn't need to have the mathematical capabilities of my father to see that this was plain cheating, and he pointed it out. And thereafter, as I say, he was persona non grata, but that was not personal to my father. There was no love lost between the socialists and the communists in post-war Hungary. I think this is historical fact.
So he was disillusioned, and he was not accepting to delude himself, so to speak.
Oh, my father was an honorable man. And the way in which the Communist Party came to power was not by honorable means. And the way in which they conducted the affairs of the state was not only not honorable, but it was downright stupid. And my father, as I described for a brief while, worked in the planning office on the 5-year plans because he had mathematical and statistical preparedness to do that. And he tried to point out some of the stupidities. And I describe an example, glaring examples of idiocies of planning, which was, which was detrimental to the welfare of the people of the country. And my father was an idealist. And yeah, no, it didn't work. I'm afraid, Professor Polanski, it did not work.
There's a question from Ocean Evans Sharma. I wanted to know why you chose Britain as your destination and whether you think Britain is the same country as it was then.
Well, that's a very interesting and very difficult question. I chose Britain for the same reasons as before. This was a nation of a democratic parliament. This was a nation of a strong trade unionist movement. And these were the ideals of my father's upbringing of me. And that is why we chose it, and this is where we came. I must say, maybe I shouldn't say it in public, but I am given to telling the truth in writing as well. The trade union movement disappointed me because it was not, when we found it here, it wasn't as I expected it. It was not forward-looking. It was protecting old practices instead of preparing people for the development of the future. There were prejudices, and I never expected that. So even when we arrived, some of the ideals that I came in search of were not found. But at that time, and to this day, I can't think of a country that I would sooner live in. It is certainly not the same country as before. It is certainly not heading in the direction where I should like to see it go. But it is still, as far as I can tell, it is still the best. And I'm very grateful to it, as I describe.
There is a more comment by Anna Lubelska about the parallels between fates, her fate, her family fate, and your fate, and this is obviously, for me, reading your book, this resonates in many ways with the fate of people in Poland, what you describe. Although there are also very important differences. So when you describe how the deportation starts from Debrecen in 44, June 44. This is just 3 or 4 days after the provisional government was established in what would become communist Poland. So in the moment when the war is over in Poland, you are facing the most atrocious of fates. So there are obviously also disconnects here. I have a question from Luisa Evarvaldo. How difficult was it to make yourself understood moving from Hungary to Vienna and later France? How many languages were you taught in college?
Yeah, well, that's an extremely interesting question. We were given, other than Latin, we were given tuition in whatever the political wind was. So for a while you learned German. I was not old enough. My husband learned German because he was older. Then we learned some French. Then we also learned some English. And then everything shut down and we had to learn Russian. And I am no great linguist. So a consequence of learning a different language as the change of the political wind occurred, resulted in some difficulties. There is a bizarre situation which has arisen in my immediate family. because I did my grammar schooling in English. I studied English, and all right, it was not much use, because I tell you, the set texts for the A-level type examination were Thomas More's Utopia and some sonnets of Shakespeare, and a part of the Canterbury, the very slippery, yes, not the slippery parts, but some part of the Canterbury Tales. And those did not allow you easy conversation with the greengrocer. So that was English. My husband similarly learned Goethe and Thomas Mann, and he couldn't, and he wasn't even as much a linguist as I was. So I found myself being the spokesman of every language in whatever country we touched down in. And as you can hear from my accent, my English is not perfect now, not even after half a century. So yeah, there were difficulties.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's an important point I must make, and that is both my husband and I could navigate our way through technical English texts, and that was important.
Yes, yes. One aspect of your book is that you describe with great clarity the atmosphere in pre-war Hungary, post-war Hungary, and one of the parallels which struck me was the parallel you described between the support for Nazi Germany in Horthy's Hungary before the war, and the presence of the ally, for example, in the school, that you had a portrait of Hitler. Do I remember this correctly? A portrait of Hitler in the classroom?
No. She was a teacher.
Oh, okay.
She was the teacher at the time of that photograph you showed of me.
Okay.
And you can see on my face what it was like, and I describe it in my book. She was a spinster. She was in love with Hitler, and Hitler's pictures were plastered all around the classroom. And she had a great problem, this teacher, because on the one hand, she told us the theories of Hitler, according to which Jews were subhumans. But on the other hand, she had a girl in class who kept on producing 100% of the marks of every assignment she gave out. So she then, as you see, she had a problem. Mm. And she solved the problem by ignoring me. She handed me assignments, which I then completed and handed back to her, but she never looked me in the face. She never uttered my name. She never asked me a question. She never talked to me. And that was a whole year of such treatment. And thinking about it, nowadays when I talk to groups of people, sometimes I am asked the question of, do I hate those people who behaved as they did towards us? And the answer is, I'm trying not to hate them. I'm trying even to forgive them. And the only way available to me is via understanding of their motives. And I could understand the motives of this teacher. The motive of the teacher was to be a devout believer in every word of Hitler. And she had a dilemma. Well, all right, that's as far as I go. I go as far as understanding the motives. I don't necessarily condone the solution.
Yes. I mean, this teacher is perhaps a good example for the atmosphere in pre-war Hungary, which was very authoritarian. Anthony Polonsky asked, how aware were you of an increase in anti-Semitic ambience, anti-Semitic atmosphere before the war? I mean, you were a young person. I remember reading that your father explained you how things work. Is this correct? Do I remember correctly?
Yes. There is a picture in the book of a very memorable cartoon. It was a poster showing an emaciated family and a couple dripping with jewels, fat and obviously wealthy. And this was a depiction, as you could see, of a Hungarian family who were so poor and the Jews who were the rich. And the caption, which is in the book, says, brother, if you want to fight this injustice, join the Arrow Cross. The Arrow Cross being the Hungarian Nazi oriented party. And I said to my father, and I was preschool, so I must have been under 6 years old. I said to my father, are you going to join the Arrow Cross? And this was logical. It was consistent with my upbringing. The social injustice had to be fought. And here was injustice in the poster. And so I describe how my father, in careful steps, but with respect for his daughter, described the situation and explained. I have to emphasize the principle that guided my father was respect for every human being, young or old, worker or rich man, respect. And if a child asked a question, then the child was entitled to a truthful answer. And he tried to explain the answer.
Do you remember this conversation well?
Oh, I remember vividly. Do you know, I remember things come to me. If I close my eyes, I could tell you which street corner, at which part of the conversation. My memories are visual, and to the pictures. That's why I give you, for example, in the book, a picture of my grandmother's courtyard, or others. I have visual images to which certain events occur, and I could tell you where we were walking with my father, when which part of the conversation. And he started by saying, this poster is a lie. It is not about the poor and the rich. It is about the Jew and the non-Jew. And so this is how he got into it.
Yes.
And he said, do you know any Jews who are rich? Yeah, I do. Do you know any Jews who are not rich? Yes, I do. We are Jews and we are not rich. So, you know, this is the way my father brought it home to me so that I could understand. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, there are two questions about more or less the same thing. Whether you returned to Hungary for in-depth research for your book. Did you go back to Hungary for the book to find material, or?
No, I did much better. I have Dr. Csősz to help me, and I wish he would come in and either make a comment or
yes, that would be lovely.
But I want to say something else about Dr. Csősz's contribution. Before he came into my life and before he came to contribute to this book, in the last 6 months before its publication, maybe even less than 6 months of its publication, I had some pictures. And those pictures came from wherever I could fetch them, maps from the internet or whatever. And yeah, he agreed that he is going to make a contribution by way of the historian's voice, as you described. But he said, not while you are having these kinds of pictures, because my pictures had to be authentic. They had to have their sources. They had to be properly backed with, absolutely.
Yes.
And so then came, the most of the difficulty came to sanitize my book with respect to these pictures, and I now have the cartographer of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, that I believe, who drew the pictures in the maps in the book and so on. And so, yeah, this made all the difference.
Yes, yes.
You see.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left.
Just to say, actually, just to say, I did unmute Dr. Csősz, and he is here with us. So I would invite him if he'd like to make a comment. Welcome, Dr. Csősz.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'm very happy to be here, of course. And I listened, even though, of course, obviously I know the stories, but it's always great to follow Agnes and her very specific style. And I always amazed by her sharpness and her comments very strictly on point. And I even made some notes, I have to tell you, following some of her remarkable comments. And of course, we have to mention that it was not only me who contributed to this book, but the mentioned Academy of Sciences, and also one of the foremost experts on modern era photography in Hungary, Katalin Jarsovsky, offered us great help in finding the illustrations. And more precisely, these are not illustrations, these photos, but these are historical documents, which we can analyze and understand, of course. And this is just obviously, because of the constraints of time, this is just a short selection of the more than 100 books. Sorry, more than 100 photos we have in the book, and I thought it could add greatly to Agnes's story. And I also wanted to add that our how to say, collaboration or cooperation with Agnes was not without conflicts, because both of us are very strong personalities, and she never just decided to give me the floor, like, you are the historian, you are with the history, but she was deeply involved. And it was sometimes a case where she wrote something and I tried to convince her it was not perfectly like that in history. And then she answered, yes, okay. And then she read 3 additional books. And the next day she returned to me with new arguments against my argument. So it was not just like I was writing peacefully historian's voice and she was writing the memoir. It was not like that. It was an intellectual struggle and sometimes fight between us. So it was quite an adventure, and I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity.
I think we are still friends, yes?
And we are still friends, of course.
That's quite an achievement.
And also what was, pardon?
I think I would like to take one last question from the audience, namely the interest your family takes in your story, Agnes.
Mm-hmm. The interest my family takes in the story.
Yeah, in the book.
Well, no, in the book,
research.
Yes. Well, first of all, I have to acknowledge that my husband read every word and he contributed in every way he could on his deathbed to this book. And he knew exactly what I wanted. He wanted independent verification of facts. And he gave me the ideas. In some cases, he tracked down people whom I could invite and interview and so on. So his contribution is immense. Now, his role was taken over after his death by my daughter, Anna. And she is by training a lawyer. She is, I haven't got the words to describe. her as a personality and our relationship to each other. I think she's much more than a daughter, and I owe her an immense amount, including correcting my idiosyncratic English quite often. And she would say quite frequently, yeah, all right, I know what you are trying to say, but it is not English. So then came the argument whether I can have it my way or must we have it her way, because she is the one who was born in this country. Anna was a tremendous help. Foremost, the contribution, I must mention, is that of Tabitha. Tabitha, age 10, who started me along the whole journey by inviting me to talk to her and her class. There are other aspects. For example, my daughter Esther, who died now nearly 18 years ago, she was, as I often say, the brains of the family, and I learned from her an immense amount. And when she was a little girl, she said to me in one particular conversation, if I am old enough to ask, and if you know your stuff, then you can explain it to me. And on that occasion, we were talking, she was about 10, and we were talking about information theory. And it wasn't a very easy subject to try to explain to a 10-year-old, but she was right. And so, and my father must have followed the same path, explaining to me the notions of fascism. So I tried to do the same in this book. I hope that this book might be read by younger people as well as by older. And I hope that it is written in a way that if somebody is interested enough and is old enough or young enough to be interested, then they can find something in it.
I think this is a wonderful ending to our conversation.
I agree.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both for such a fascinating discussion, and of course to Francois for brilliantly leading the conversation. And a very special thank you to you, Agnes, for recounting your remarkable life story. Congratulations to you and Dr. Csősz, who of course was very happily joined us tonight for this tremendous achievement. And thank you, of course, also to the audience for joining us and for your terrific comments and questions. So thank you again. And yes.